On behalf of the London ACEs Hub, a warm welcome to our conversation this evening. We have people that have signed in from beyond the UK borders, those in the country, from Scotland, Ireland, those that have signed from England, and especially those that are in London, welcome. The London ACEs Hub aims to promote awareness of adverse childhood experiences, or the acronym ACEs, among the diverse communities in London. ACEs have a consequence, both mental and physical, that last well into adulthood, leading to poor health and loss of opportunity. This is why we're committed to raising questions about the persistence of common adversities in London, including all forms of discrimination. Our Racial Justice Working Group, which I co-lead with Koya, has therefore urged that racism be declared a public health crisis in London. This evening's conversation is part of a series which will continue to engage with people, with everyone interested in a better and a fairer future for London's communities. I would like to hand over to Koya and Roger, both members of the Racial Justice Working Group, who are going to facilitate this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mpume. Before we start, Koya will now restate our call to action, which we issued last September. Thank you, Koya.
Calls to action, 26th of September statement. The London ACEs Hub recognises and acknowledges that racism is an adverse childhood experience that causes deep-rooted traumas, denies the full humanity and limits the opportunities to thrive of individuals and communities, resulting in a loss for society as a whole. We believe that there is an urgent and growing evidence that the individual, interrelational and historical harm produced by racism constitutes a public health crisis in London. This crisis can be addressed and prevented by proactive awareness raising, empathy building and cultural, systemic and structural changes. We call for support and appeal to the London government, statutory and non-statutory organisations, parents and heads of homes, children and young people, educators, multidisciplinary professionals, survivors and community advocates from all backgrounds to prevent and end the harmful consequences of racism. We have the power as individuals and a collective to make this happen, one committed step at a time, to end the adverse childhood experience of racism in London. Thank you all for coming today. We are very pleased to be connecting with you all. My name's Koya.
Hi, it's great to meet you. Our title today is Young People, Racial Trauma and Criminal Justice, Breaking the Chains.
So, what is racial trauma? Racial trauma has been described as a specific outcome of racism formed out of stressful experience that is sudden, negative, and uncontrollable. Those affected are subject to a range of challenging experiences such as flashbacks and anxiety. It can be collective in that groups have common experiences over similar periods of times. It can be intergenerational in that the experience is carried in memory and biology, and versions of it are transferred to successive generations. In the aftermath of events worldwide last year, including London and other places in the UK, there has been much wider attention to collective experiences of racial trauma, starting with the long era of enslavement and evident in the history of massacres perpetrated against Black and brown people.
Thank you, Koya. For many years now, criticism has focused on discrimination against Black and brown people in criminal justice. And I can remember those debates about harsh sentences for so-called mugging offences and the use of the discredited sus laws, as well as concerns about deaths in custody. It's been a long story. More recently, the Lamy Review in 2017 found powerful evidence of discrimination in the courts and in prison. But discrimination impacts in various ways. What if it's insulting, humiliating, injurious? What if the pain is shared among whole groups? What if it's something that parents talk about with their children? Are we talking about a collective and intergenerational trauma? How do these outcomes feel? And how can they be reduced and healed? How can these chains be broken? These are our topics this evening.
Unavoidably, this is a painful topic, and the conversation this evening may bring up memories that might be disturbing to you. We want to make sure that this experience is positive and constructive for you all. If there are any painful moments, we understand if you wish to pause and step back before returning. To bring us together in remembrance and respect before our conversation, we invite all of you to join us in a minute of silence to remember someone important to you who has been a victim of racial trauma and ill treatment. Let us all pause now to remember those significant people. Thank you. We hope that this event will provide you with the information and opportunity to consider the depths of the problems. But also we hope it will inspire us all to think about ways of increasing hope and resilience, promoting recovery and pushing for serious changes in criminal justice. Let us remind you that the event is being recorded for the benefit of people who cannot be here today. Please bear this in mind if you want to put questions or make comments.
Thanks, Koya. Well, we're now very happy to introduce our first speaker, Leroy Logan, MBE. Leroy is a former superintendent in the Metropolitan Police and a former chair of the Black Police Association. He's the author of Closing Ranks, My Life as a Cop, and his life story formed the basis for the acclaimed Small Axe television production Red, White and Blue. He's taken a leading role in Voyage Youth, a charity empowering marginalized Black young people. Leroy is also a consultant director of the London ACEs Hub. Leroy, can you speak for 10 minutes, please?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you all. I just want to say that this issue is very close to my heart. As Roger, you highlighted in the introduction that part of my life, especially in the early stages of my time in the Met, was captured by Steve McQueen, Oscar-winning director, and played by John Boyega. And the opening scene of that episode, Red, White and Blue, was little Leroy in his school uniform with his trumpet case, waiting at the school gates for his dad to pick him up. And lo and behold, little Leroy was the only one to be stopped and searched by the police. And the other white members of the band, after band practice, didn't get bothered. And that was my first encounter of the sus law. This was in 1971. And it has never left me. So you would think, why would I still join the Met Police? Especially when my father was beaten up by police over a traffic stop as I was in the process of joining in 1982. And in fact, the recent beating of a 70-year-old Black man that was highlighted in the media only 2 weeks ago just reminded me so much of how my father looked, because he was stopped by officers and ends up in A&E with massive head injuries, similar to that man a couple of weeks ago. So I'm living this on a daily basis. But it has never stopped me from thinking that you can't make changes from within. And that's why I joined the Met in '83 and was one of the founding members and past chair of both the London and the National Black Police Association. because we recognize that we have to call it out for what it is. And the main time we were able to do that was the Macpherson inquiry in '98. And the Labour government was earnestly trying to deal with racial inequalities and injustices in the wider justice system. And those recommendations really highlighted on stop and search and Section 60 roadblocks under the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act to start to hold the Commissioner and other Chief Constables to account. And as Roger's already said, I was also the founder member of Voids Youth. It was the BPA Charitable Trust, and then we rebranded it a few years ago. And what we try to do is to work with our young people who are subject to stop and search, to be able to recognize their own rights and responsibilities. So if they do get stopped, to know what to look for, and to have certain things that come to mind for the officer, to know the grounds why they're getting stopped, the object in which the officer is looking for, the officer, whether they're in uniform or not, should have a warrant card, the identity officer, if they've got numbers on their shoulder or an insignia, and then any other identifiable marks or badges. We now have officers. One of the reasons for officers having badges is to hold them to account. And if they're not being dealt with properly, the person can complain. So all of these things is to help them to know that they can change their environment, not become a victim of it, and develop positive peer-to-peer mentoring to assist them to deal with the impact of stop and search. Because we know that it's not just the person on the receiving end, but also the family and friends who hear about this or have seen it through social media or otherwise. And so the scale of the trauma is a wider community trauma, especially when so many cases are shown on WhatsApp. And each time I see them personally, as a police officer, not wishing to judge whether the person was right or even the police was right, not wishing to judge who was wrong, but it still shows that there's this impact, and it's reducing trust and confidence in police. In fact, I publicly said that trust and confidence in the police is an all-time low, worse than it has been for over 20, 30 years, because the look and feel of policing is so enforcement-based, especially since this government took control in 2010 and turned their back on the Macpherson recommendations, especially when it came to stop and search, and trying to row back on institutional racism. And we all know that they tried to change the narrative with the CRED report by Tony Sewell et al., and trying to make us think that all is well, and institutional racism and all the other forms of systemic failures is just in our imagination, and undermining our intelligence by saying there's not a problem here, and using people that look like me to bring out this false narrative. And that has such a massive impact on our young people when they see that people who look like them are trying to say that their pain and their trauma is not really important. And that's why working with young people is still part of my DNA, part of my public service, especially since I retired 8 years ago. Working with young people so they know how to deal with that trauma on a regular basis. So in closing, I'm just going to say what I'm doing about it. Especially since my autobiography, Closing Ranks, that inspired the Small Axe film, Red, White and Blue, I've realized that people are willing to have that conversation, especially since George Floyd in May of last year. The world changed after George Floyd. And I couldn't have timed my book and that film better, because it was part of the discourse, and young people are willing to talk about it. As recently as yesterday, I was in a school and they could identify with both, and they wanted to speak about the trauma they're going through. And then they want to be part of an initiative that I'm doing called Capturing Voices with Middlesex University, where we assess the trauma that they go through and their family and friends, so that we can give a qualitative assessment that shows impact. Because unfortunately, the police are still in this, they can arrest their way out the problem and they can stop and search their way out the problem without really understanding the impact. They're in denial, and I'm sad to say that the look and feel policing is worse than it's ever been. It's too enforcement based and they don't care about the impact they're having. So the Capturing Voices work that I'm doing with the ACES Hub is something I believe we can put to the Mayor of London, to the Commissioner, and hopefully start to work significantly to change the whole way policing is done in London. And I suppose finally, prevent headlines like this in the Evening Standard. I know she's still a young person, and she was the victim of a kidnapping, a rape, a murder by a police officer. And the police have to do something about this. And hopefully the Commissioner will do something about it. If not, get someone who will. Thank you.
Thank you, Leroy. That was very powerful. So now we are really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Whitney Isles. Whitney holds multiple professional roles and has over 19 years of experience as a frontline practitioner working with young people and communities affected by violence. Her experience expands across the community and criminal justice system, having worked in several prison estates with high-risk individuals. She has trained in forensic psychodynamic and organizational psychotherapy at the Tavistock and Portman Clinic and Association of Psychodynamic Practice and Counselling in organizational settings. Her specialist focus is on violence and trauma using a psychoanalytic framework, which influences her work as both a practitioner and a trainer. In 2019, Whitney completed an MSc in Violence, Conflict and Development at SOAS. She is currently studying for an MSc in Psychology and Neuroscience of Mental Health at King's College London, as well as a diploma in Naturopathic Nutrition at the College of Naturopathic Medicine. Whitney, can you please speak for us and share with us for the 10 minutes? Thank you.
So what I would like to do today is just kind of share some of the conversations and the questions that me and my team have amongst ourselves, because one of the things that we don't like to do is shy away from the difficult conversations that we need to have. But before I kind of go into the points that I would like to make, I called in a favor from one of my friends who is currently in the prison system, because I wanted to bring some context for the points that I will make. So if you bear with me, this is about a minute long, but I thought it was relevant to have someone who we're speaking about's voice heard today.
I'm 26 years old and I'm currently serving a life sentence for a John and Price murder conviction. I was asked by a good friend of mine, Whitney Isles, to share my insight on the effect of kids like myself getting a life sentence at a very young age, which results in us growing up in the system. I myself came to prison at the age of 16, just 2 months shy from my 17th birthday, with no proper life experience like so many others. And to be honest, we were all just children who lacked education and self-worth. And I personally recognized this during my transition. Growing up in the system is the hardest thing every child will face because you're all by yourself with no physical guidance. And the reality of having to spend more years in prison than you've been alive can be hard to fathom. It's a massive test for your mind state, and I personally believe that prison is more of a mental challenge than it is physical. Of course, your body will mature during your years in prison, but it is also important that you seek all the knowledge you need to mature your mind too, or else you'll be a child stuck in a man's body.
So I wanted to take a moment to think about the multitude of oppressions that young people face. The trauma of poverty, racial trauma that we've spoken about today, relational trauma, developmental trauma. In many of the communities today, we have community violence, which is community trauma, and intergenerational trauma. And the fact that this is happening over and over again, and a lot of these young people are not being able to escape. Like Leroy said, what we see is all over social media. It's shared via WhatsApp. This is complex trauma, and it has a load of different effects and different ways of expressing itself. So then you put this child in prison for more years than they've been alive. On top of that, we face a global pandemic where those children, those young people, those young adults are then in a prison cell for over 23 hours a day. And he's right. Prison is more mental than it is physical. But if we really start thinking about the physical implications of prison and sending children to prison, I think we are facing a reality that we're not willing to really come to terms with yet. When we think about ACEs and the ACEs framework, we understand that there is a biological repercussion of chronic stress, of cortisol, of inflammation. And these are some of the things that we are yet to have conversations about. And in relation to mentality, there are many different coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms that children and young people need to take on and to create in order to survive the trauma of prison. And these can be both positive and negative. And now it seems that there's a move towards ACE-aware and trauma-informed prisons. But I asked the question, if an institution is fundamentally trauma-inducing, can it also be trauma-informed? Can that duality exist? Does trauma-informed mean anything within this context? Or are we creating further risk by exposing young people, adults, and staff to the reality of the system and to the reality of the roles that they play? Or does the reflection and the space to think create the systemic change needed? Is it ethical to conduct therapy in prison and allow or ask for someone to step away from their coping mechanisms and the things that they need in order to survive, in order to explore what might have been going on underneath the surface to bring them to prison in the first place? This was a question I faced very early on in my career in the prison estate. Coming in with the best intentions, like let's help people heal, but then realizing that they're going back to a cell at the end of the day and all the trauma that they face throughout their day within the prison estate. So at 507, we choose therapeutic practice over therapy. But even then, we've had to ask ourselves some really difficult questions of, are we complicit in the systemic harm by working in these institutions? By taking money from the prisons, by taking money from the government in order to go in, do we then fuel the beast in an unintentional way? These are a lot of the conversations that we've been having, because we know that these systems are trauma-inducing. We know that these systems are institutionally racist. So where does that sit in our own minds, in our own psyches of what happens when we take money in order to go in and do the work? Yes, the work feels good, and therapy and therapeutic services can feel good, and they can make changes in individual lives. But then do we become ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, waiting each time for a young person to go up and fall down before we collect them and put a plaster over a stab wound? And especially that organizations and those of us that come from minoritized communities that then go into the prison estate and work with minoritized communities, and those who are on the bridge of intersection between marginalized communities and their own kind of individual unique experiences of many systemic oppressions and systemic harms. Joint enterprise, which is a case my friend is on, is known to be racially unjust and disproportionate. And we know that through the work of Patrick Williams and Becky Clark. It's a tool for systemic violence, and it creates racial trauma within itself. And not just for the young people that it sentences or tends to sentence, which is predominantly young men, for the rest of their lives, because these are life sentences, they don't ever come off license, but their entire families and the communities that they're part of. One of the biggest lessons I learned working in the prisons estate was we have so many young people, especially young Black people within our communities, grieving the loss of their friends on life sentences, not just those that have been murdered. And for those that are not aware of joint enterprise, it's a law that is being used, or a statute that is being used to imprison multiple young people at a time. So even if one young person has committed a murder, all the young people in the group that may have been on the scene, and in some cases weren't on the scene, will go in for the same amount of years. I've worked with 18-year-olds that are doing 34 years in prison for homicides, when they weren't the ones that committed the murder. And in fact, the ones that committed the murder weren't even in prison yet. We are losing many young people into the prison estate on these huge sentences, which have very little benefit long-term. I asked the questions to myself and my team. Does it then become abusive to introduce the notion of ACEs and trauma-informed work and therapy within these estates, or are we actually doing some good? Does the therapy that we offer equate to actual healing? Or are we teaching young people to deal with the systemic harms that they face? I think it's time that we really start to think about the harder questions and have these conversations. There's already amazing work being done by people like Divert and Divert Youth, who work with young people, especially non-violent young people, and divert them away from the criminal justice system and get them into jobs and get them into education and training. But we always fall short when we start to think about severe and serious violence. These are still questions, these are still conversations that are really difficult to have, because a young person that has experienced complex trauma can also be a young person that is very capable of severe violence. But these are still young people that are having very limited choices, and actually through putting them in prison for life and putting them in prison for years longer than they've been alive, sentences for longer than they've been alive, what is the end goal? And I think when we start to think about young people in prison, and we understand the Lamy Review, and that even after the Lamy Review, the disproportionality of children and Black and brown children in the criminal justice system has actually increased. And until we start having very real and authentic conversations about what it is that we're doing and our end goal, what is going to happen is those young people, those children that are in the prison estate, will become adults in the prison estate. And we end up with a larger disproportionality of Black men and Black women and brown men and brown women, and even within the traveller community within the prison estate, because we're not dealing with things at the root cause. I will wait until a later section before we start thinking about solutions, because I know that there is some time then. That's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Whitney. That was powerful. Thank you very much. For our audience, please feel welcome to use our chat to say hello, and also Q&A for questions and comments. And so, like I said, thanks so much, Whitney. Now I would like to introduce our third speaker, the amazing Derek Williams. Please, would you like to share with us 10 minutes of your time?
Thank you, Koya. And it was great listening to Whitney and to Leroy. My focus tonight is looking at the gang matrix, looking at gangs and looking at what happened over the years that's led us to the position we're in now. We're trying to find the solution on curbing the gang problems that we have in the UK, but especially London, because I'm focusing on the gang matrix, which was set up in 2011, end of 2011, 2012, where the Metropolitan Police set up the gang matrix to try to, is a kind of a risk assessment for the gang culture, which was spreading across London. But the problem that we had, which I identified and in doing research, is that there was a disproportionate number of Black and brown young people who was just scraped up and put on the gang matrix list, where the police and other organizations were able to access these lists and see the names of, sometimes some young people were being put on the gang matrix who had they've been involved in criminality, but non-violent. So when you think about that, and you think that the vulnerable children walking around in groups who were just taken up and put into gangs, is a way of kind of a blip on their record for future, because companies like job centers and people trying to look for new recruits would find a young person's name on that list and see that that child has been put on a gang matrix. So immediately they think that this child or young person is a violent criminal, which that wasn't the case. So that was a fundamental flaw with the gang matrix, which I think it should have been scrapped. Leroy spoke earlier of being stopped in 1971 under the SUS law. And then I myself was stopped in 1981 under the SUS law. So it's something that's been going around for years, and we've got to try to find a way to find a solution to how we can overcome in effect, police harassment of young Black and brown people who can be walking around in a group of friends and they could be stopped. Because what happened is the police, they have a system called, it's like a traffic light system. They call it RAG, red, amber, and green. And as you add it to the list, they give you a number of how violent that particular child or young person is. So, and wrongfully they're criminalizing young children who've most probably been involved in some kind of pickpocket offense or something like that, or backchatting the police. But what I realize is that the misunderstanding between the community and the police is that we have to try to build that bridge, try to get a community involvement where people are able to relate to the police and the police are able to understand, because it's going to be a continuing problem where we'll find police criminalizing young Black and brown boys and girls who, like Whitney mentioned, spending a lifetime in prison, sometimes for things that they haven't even done, or just being associated with people. So it's always, for me, I've had over 20 years experience of working with young people in gangs. And right now, I have so much stories that are so similar to young people who have been stopped and they're being with a criminal record because of, not only because of the color of the skin, but the clothes that they wear, or their actions, the music they listen to, or police have been following them on social media. So if you think about it, these people are being victimized and criminalized for all purposes that we need to find a way, because the government has backed the gang matrix. It's a government-backed initiative. The mayor had, like I said, 1,000 names removed from the gang matrix list. And of those names, it was almost 80% were Black and brown people. If you look at how to overcome that, is to educate the police, educate the communities, and also we look at early intervention where we can try to prevent young children and young people from getting involved in a life where they can be singled out or picked on, because sometimes that's exactly what it is. They've been singled out and put on this list without having any valid reason for being there. Sometimes it's just backchatting the police or resisting an arrest. All these things that come to mind. And I know to myself that as a young boy, I looked at the police, and the reason why I got involved in working with young people is because I know what it was like to be harassed by the police throughout the years. Coming up, 16-year-old school kid in uniform, being harassed by the police to be stopped and searched. And it went on continually to a young man driving a car, the police pulling you over to search. So So this way of life, where they say now they have the gang matrix, the gang matrix wasn't around in my time, but they had the sus laws, and they had, which was the stop and search. So it's like it's a continual work where we work together to try to find solutions. The London ACEs Hub looks at the adverse childhood experiences, and these are adverse childhood experiences because the young children, the young people take these things. It's an emotional attachment where you think to yourself that the people who are supposed to be protecting you are actually criminalizing you, arresting and putting you on a list, and you become recognized as a gang member, violent gang member. And how do you stop that? Where do we go? There's so much questions to be answered tonight, and I look forward to the further discussion later on tonight as we talk further and look at what's the first step? Because the government reports, and if I say this is not a political discussion for me, but the government reports are not exactly correct, where they say that the institutional racism doesn't exist, or they don't recognize these things because they have to paint the picture of being a just government and a just corporation, a company. So where do we start? And that's my question tonight. It's a big situation that I know to myself that we're in it, and we have to try to, instead of going deeper into it without dealing with this, we have to scrap that. And for me, the gang matrix needs to be scrapped immediately. And that's a point I want to mention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. That was equally as powerful as the other speakers. I just also want to let everyone know that Derek is actually our community engagement lead for the London ACEs Hub, among other many wonderful things as well. Roger?
Thank you so much. Well, wonderful presentations, but many powerful points, probably too many to summarize. But now we open the floor to people who have questions. We know that this is a very knowledgeable audience. Thanks for sharing some of the things you've told us about yourselves. So yeah, some important questions. Do use the Q&A, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. That's very useful. Also in the chat, I've kind of noticed a few points which I'll bring to you now. For example, Mpume's mentioned, or a statement now, we criminalize these ACEs victims. That's one of the implications of what we've been told. Are we indeed complicit with the system? Would anyone in the panel like to respond to that?
It's a question that when you say are we complicit, no, we because we understand in the ACEs, London ACEs Hub, we understand the challenges of young children and the experiences that they go through sometimes. The system criminalizes a lot of young people because the system hasn't really taken the time to understand what the child's has gone through, what their background is. They have to understand the backstory sometimes. So I'd say that we're not complicit, but and we're working with a system that has to understand. That's what I would say.
Okay, and thanks, Derek. Any more comments on complicity?
Yeah, I'll step in there. I think Whitney asked that question about duality and how can you try and turn around an organization that induces trauma and then try and get them trauma informed, and being complicit by doing that. I think it's also, well, a lot of it is around how we challenge and how we use the data to hold people to account. I really think that we're in a situation where we're not going to see change through the politicians in government. We've got one of the most right-wing governments in recent memory. And as a result of that, they allow the police and other public organizations to carry out their enforcement-based narratives and strategies, which is adding trauma on an exponential rate. So it's very disappointing, but we can't be discouraged. We have to find ways in which we hold those in authority at central, regional, and local government. And I think one of the reasons why we came together in the London ACES hub was to, how can we use our people power, our collective expertise to really address these things? Because we can't just ignore this situation. We got to work even more sophisticated, evidence-based, to hold people to account, where they just have to look at things. But I take the point that even Whitney was saying about the Lamy Review, and that was held to be an authoritative piece, but the disproportionalities are just the same. I was working on the Youth Violence Commission from 2016 to 2020, and our 2 reports in 2018 and 2020, again, had some sort of impact. We got violence reduction units, but even the violence reduction units are being used in a way that is not actually addressing the issues. And we've seen that the gangs matrix, which is to assess risk and harm, that's actually criminalizing people, even though some have been, 1,000 have been taken off. But so what we have to do is to know our stuff. We really need to be experts in our field and come together and collaborate and have people who would normally be on the sidelines coming together. And as I said, the world changed after George Floyd. I'm not being fanciful or idealistic. I really do believe that people are coming together, and the allyship, I think, is really important to address these things. So yeah, it's a tough call, because we could be seen as complicit, but we need to be working earnestly and in a very sophisticated way to keep the pressure on the government and police and the wider justice system.
Okay, I think really quite important question from Joanna. Doughty Chambers, the law firm, have been promoting trauma-informed lawyering, which is crucial. This focuses initially on youth justice, and she's interested in young adults, Black young people who have additional challenges relating to autism. She believes the system cannot or refuse to respond to this intersectionality, choosing instead to criminalize and not see vulnerability. And she'd be interested in thoughts on this intersectionality, a number of issues wrapped up, and very much racism and other issues. Perhaps Whitney, you might like to respond to that one.
So neurodiversity is one of my things. So you've definitely got me there. We know within kind of the neurodiverse field anyway, there is a lot of institutional racism and there's a lot of systemic oppression. If you are Black, you are less likely to get access to assessments, for example. So you're less likely to get an official autism diagnosis. If you are female, you're less likely to get an autism access to an autism assessment and an autism diagnosis, for example, because autism it shows differently in women and girls. And then so therefore, if you're a Black woman or a woman of color, again, there's kind of additional intersectionalities of that and additional experiences. For me, something like autism, I've seen a lot of it, especially in relation to young Black men, and then being kind of put into the criminal justice system, especially on joint enterprise cases. So if you've got a young person that is at the scene of a crime and may not kind of fully comprehend the social complexities of what's going on around them, or may kind of have a sensory processing disorder, where they're easily overwhelmed and their system is overwhelmed by too much information and too many things going on at once, what you might see is that young person freeze. If you freeze on the scene of a murder and you don't kind of do anything, if you don't run away or you don't get help and you literally just don't do anything, then actually you can be seen as being complicit in that murder because of the fact that you didn't do anything. So there's an argument for the fact that there was intent or there was foresight. And these are the things that I see that are completely kind of misunderstood within the criminal justice system. I think we're starting to see more and more stats coming out now about the number, the levels of neurodiversity, ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia, all within the criminal justice system. Now, there is a very other key thing that people don't really think about, and that's the overlap between complex trauma and neurodiversity. So on one hand, if you are neurodiverse, so again, if you are autistic, for example, and say you've got a sensitive sensory system, you are more prone to have traumatic experiences because you're more prone to have your kind of normal coping mechanisms overwhelmed, which is what trauma is, because your coping mechanisms on a day-to-day have a lower threshold than a neurotypical person. On the flip side of that, a child who has experienced a lot of complex trauma, especially in the formative years, can then develop traits which are very similar to ADHD, very similar to autism. So it's very wrapped around and it's very similar. And what we're thinking about with either complex trauma or neurodiversity, they are very overlapping and relational issues there. And I think the criminal justice system is starting to understand neurodiversity a lot more, is starting to understand kind of brain injury as well, which is another side of this. It's less understanding of the fact that complex trauma can also have an effect in all of this. But I think that there's huge space to start to kind of learn and understand. And part of the issues with the criminal justice system, for example, is the fact that our prison ministers and our Secretary of State change so frequently. So our previous Secretary of State for Justice had a real vision for neurodiversity, and it was a real passion. That person is now out of post. So we're going to have to wait and see if the stuff around neurodiversity continues now we've got a new person in post. So it's a big subject.
It certainly is, and we're really grateful to you for those insights. I mean, at the London ACEs Hub, we're very interested in development, how development happens, how it's altered, how it can be impacted, and how it can be healed. So I think that this is our conversation's starting to develop in a very interesting way. So perhaps now this might be the time to ask for your solutions, and that's something Koya is going to do.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and to our speakers as well. We're now going to ask, as Roger just said, each of our panelists to suggest one thing that they believe would help to promote resilience and hope and lead to change.
Yep. I'll step forward. Well, I've touched on what I think is my own personal sort of commitment to trying to assess trauma through the Capturing Voices project. And that data is not just to try and persuade the police and the other wider justice system to acknowledge there is a case and to change, but it's also potential, I believe, for a super complaint and going to the courts. Because if there's anything that has really shown that the police can be held to account to some extent, is in the courts. And I've been encouraged by the Bar Council that they're looking at being a lot more equitable and transparent about the whole processes in the courts. And I would like to think that if we can test these cases around trauma in the courts, whether it's a super complaint or some sort of class action, that will send a very strong signal to our young people, whether in the prison system or they're caught up in the matrix or in the streets or whatever, that something's being done. Because I get a sense that there's a certain amount of hopelessness that people think, well, nothing can be done and there won't be any change. So I'd like to think that the data we do come together to collect in a very defined way can go towards a class action and or a super complaint to show that we're in a we're not to be trifled with. It's no nonsense. And the good thing is, I said through the Bar Council, we're seeing a lot of lawyers and that allyship in those lawyers, QCs, etc., have been extremely open to that. And I would like to see that happening, because that would send a strong signal of hope for young people who have been the victim of the system of institutional racism and other systemic failures.
Derek?
My thing is, it's the understanding between the police and the communities. Like what Leroy was saying, is we have to have some kind of class action, because a lot of times the people who are supposed to be there to protect you are in fact criminalizing and victimized. They're using these young people and they're victimizing young people. So my thing is the bridge, to bridge that gap between the community and the police, because the police, you have the biggest police force in the UK, Met Police, and I'm talking about London. So you got over 30,000 police officers at any one time policing the police in London. But if they don't understand the communities or the cultures, different cultures they're working with, they'll always have that problem. They always have a problem because they haven't taken the time to understand what that culture is all about. So if a child backchats or say something, they're happy to arrest and criminalize that child because that child has spoken back. So we've got to build that bridge, the understanding between the police and the communities. And I think that's very important, because if we don't do that, we're going to continually having conflicts and wrongful arrests and wrongful treatment. That's going to continually on back and forth. So I think that's a big major change and it needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Derek. Whitney?
In relation to solutions, I like to ask the big questions and really challenge myself and our community about kind of big change, because I've been doing this work for almost 20 years now, and a lot of the time I sit in rooms and people always kind of shy away from big change, and they think, okay, let's see if we can do small footsteps and small bits of change. But I feel like there's so much negative change. Small footsteps can leave you feeling quite hopeless after a while. And I'd be really interested to see how we could create alternatives to the prison estate. Could we stop sending children, and I mean children, so I mean the under 18s, the 13-year-olds, the 14-year-olds, the 15-year-olds, could we stop sending them to prison for life? Could there be an alternative solution rather than sending young people on huge sentences? Because from my professional experience, a 10-year sentence, a 15-year sentence has no impact anything more than a 5-year sentence. Most of these young people in a 5-year sentence would get as much from it as they would in a 10 and 15-year sentence, because for the first 5 or 10 years, those young people are in shock anyway, so they're not engaging as they should, and most of them are just going along to get along. So I'm really interested in how us as a community could start thinking about and really be rigorous with the research and the action research around alternatives to custody for the under 18s, especially those who are potential perpetrators or perpetrators of serious violence, because those are the ones that tend to get left out of a lot of the comments in relation to community sentences and community-based work. But those tend to be the ones that have also faced the most complex trauma, and that hasn't been dealt with. So for me, solutions include stop putting children in prison for life, and start thinking about the alternative solutions, because other countries have done this already. So we can as well.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you. Okay, so we now have some time for some more questions. So I'm just going to check. There's some statements and some questions that we have in the chat. Bear with me. Oh, we've actually got a statement here, which from Dominina, that says solutions. Divert funding to more powerful programs for the community. Understanding that organizing the community is better than trying to convince people to see us as human.
Can I just pick up on the diverting funds piece? Because I think we touched on the fact that racism is an ace from our opening statement. But I know from George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, we're talking about defunding the police. And I don't particularly align myself to that statement, because it is buying into the narrative of the right wingers to say, oh, you're trying to get rid of the police, and it plays into their narrative. So the defunding the police label, I think, is counterproductive. But I do understand the need to divert funds from the police so that they don't go to calls where mental health cases, especially where it involves Black men, because I know that a lot of police officers actually fear Black men. And if you then say they've got a mental challenge, then they're going to be even more excessive with the force. And we've seen so many deaths in police contacts because of that. And we know we've had our own George Floyd with Rashan Charles and others around the country around excessive force that leads to avoidable deaths, which unfortunately the coroner's courts invariably say is a lawful death. But we've had some successes, very few I know. So we need to prevent police officers going into these sort of calls, and there's more of a chance of a triage approach. We've seen that in America and other parts of Europe, where the officers patrol with paramedics or approved social workers, etc., so that they're not, officers are not getting all pumped up with the blue lights and sirens, and when they arrive at the scene, they're not accelerating everything, they're actually de-escalating. It's when they escalate everything, that's when invariably goes wrong. So I would like to think that we can do a lot of focused asset-based policing. We've seen it in Glasgow. When I was working on the Youth Violence Commission, as I mentioned earlier, we went up to Glasgow and they do an asset-based approach. And it is part of the public health model. And I know that model has been highly labeled and discussed, and not many people really understand what it is. But I think it is a way of reassigning assets, expert assets, to calls, and invariably not leaving it down to police, because police, in some respects, politicians think police should be going to all of these calls, and they don't need to be, because they create more problems than not. So I think the reassigning of assets can be a lot more sophisticated and reducing police going to critical cases which they're not skilled to deal with.
Thank you, Leroy.
Koya, can I look at the ACEs, the individual ACEs, the community and individual ACEs, racism being an ACE? That was a question that someone asked earlier. Yeah, because if you think about it, right, can you imagine a young person, a young child in the community from a broken home, where a father has been unable to excel in a job because of the color of their skin? Sometimes that happens, that they're unable to provide for the child, young, or their family the way they want to. The child can become frustrated and try to go out and try to find a way of making money to help their family, or they might be forced out to do it. They might be forced out to, they see the struggle that their single mother might be going on, or their single father. So the experience that they're having from a very young age, they become an adult before their time. trying to make money to help their parents feed the family, feed the younger brothers and sisters. So they can easily be led astray, or they become vulnerable. They're vulnerable people, vulnerable young people who can be influenced into doing something illicit because it's the only way they know, or they're trying to help. So that's an individual experience from someone from a community who wants to do good. They're going out to do good. They set out to do good, but then they've been led up the wrong path, and they enter the life of crime, so to speak. So when you talk about individual experiences and racism, that is one of the reasons I look at that a lot, because a lot of children from broken homes, because the parents are unable to provide for the child, because they're unable to be given positions in their company. So all these things, it's like a ripple effect on the families. So that's something we've got to look at.
Thank you, Derek.
Sorry, Roger, did you want to say something?
Sorry, no, if you go ahead, if you want to respond to that.
I want to think about it as well. So when we think about healing, so if I was working with a young person and we wanted to conduct therapy, or we were intervening in a young person's life because of the trauma that they've experienced, one of the things that we want to do is take them away from the experiences that is causing them harm. And we want to create a kind of positive environment that they feel safe in. The whole thing around trauma is you don't feel safe, and your body has a fight or flight or freeze reaction, and your body has a kind of reaction to triggers where it doesn't feel safe, and it wants to kind of feel safe, and there's this actual safety and perceived sense of safety. Now, something like racism, because it's so vast, and we're not kind of just thinking about racism between people and that direct racism. Racism is very invisible in a lot of settings. You feel it. It's a look, it's a feel, it's that kind of uncomfortableness that sometimes you can't put words to. And especially if we're thinking about young people and what they might see and what they might perceive, and have they developed the language to really understand it yet, and to really think about it. But then if it's embedded in all of the institutions that they're engaging in, how can they create healing from it? So I think racism is an ACE. I don't necessarily use the ACE term, but racism is a trauma, and racism is a trauma that is overbearing at times, a lot of the times, and overwhelming, because it's almost something like you can't get away from it. If you're in relationship with something that's harmful and you can't get away and you can't find a safe space, how do you then create the ability to heal? And it's the same with what we were talking about with the kids in the prison estate. Where and when can we do that healing process if none of the spaces within the prison are safe? And this is why community spaces and community-led spaces are really, really important in the narrative around healing, because they become the safe spaces, actually safe and safe from a perception. You feel safe in there. And this is when we start to kind of pull back a lot of the clinical language. Essentially what we're talking about is, how do we make people feel safer? And how can we make people feel safer within a society which can still be systemically harmful? And these are complex ideologies. These are complex theories and realities to navigate between. But I definitely kind of 100% agree that racism is traumatic, and it's traumatic in the sense of as well, because it can be incredibly difficult to actually get away from it.
Thank you. I have a question here that can be answered by all three of you. Would like some feedback from all three of you in this, and it's the question from Amanda, and it's: do you have examples of decision makers or organisations or systems that were previously resistant or shut off from being trauma informed, but then deeply embraced the trauma informed approach that unlocked and drove change?
I'm actually doing a piece of work on this as we speak. And I know that they won't mind me speaking about it. I am currently working as a consultant with the Borough of Lambeth, and we are working. They've asked me to come in, contracted me to come in to work with all the departments across Lambeth that work with children or have some kind of role in a child's life. So police, YOS, social services, education, mental health, hospitals, GPs, housing, across the board. And actually, the aim for Lambeth at the moment is to become a trauma-informed borough. In fact, a trauma-responsive borough, because being trauma-informed is not enough. And we're currently working with, I have 25 trauma champions that represent all the different departments. And I've been training them up directly, and we do weekly session or fortnightly reflective practice sessions. And what we're doing together is training up, we're working to train the kind of all the professionals in the borough, as well as look at policy, look at practice, look at kind of all the smaller things that happen on a day-to-day that need to be changed. And we've just been commissioned now to actually run some training with the leaders of the borough, so the council members, the directors, the deputy directors, so we can start thinking about change at every level. This is not an easy piece of work. This is an incredibly complex piece of work that will take at least 5 to 10 years. But actually we're starting, and all these kind of conversations and questions that I'm posing today, these are the conversations and the questions that I'm having with the champions kind of week in, week out, because we are having to navigate through all of this grey area and balance the kind of the well-being of the children and the staff and those that are kind of now starting to understand trauma and kind of the beast of it, and think about how do we become trauma-informed in a trauma-inducing borough and in trauma-inducing systems. So I think there is an appetite for change, but I think it's very slow change, and a lot of people that want this change don't quite understand how complex it is and how much this relies on systemic change and almost kind of ripping apart and destroying old systems and rebuilding new ones. So I'm seeing more of an appetite for it, and I'm seeing people actually wanting to change, but the major questions is how do we change systems that are kind of so embedded in our society and in our cultures as well. So it's a bittersweet thing at the moment. I'm seeing it happening, but it's hard work.
I think what Whitney just highlighted is local governments seem to show more leadership than regional and central government. So, you know, when you've got leadership like Lambeth and couple of other boroughs in London. We're seeing some other local governments outside London, Reading, some work in Birmingham. So it shows it's very patchy. And I suppose, you know, it's like eating an elephant. It's, you know, one mouthful at a time. You have to do it step by step. But it's so disappointing that central government and even regional governments, you know, the regional mayors, etc., have not really caught this as they should at the level, so you can get more consistency across towns and cities in the UK. So, and in answer to the question about where you've seen them embracing it, I think it's at the local government level. Hopefully, we can increase the number of local authorities to be a lot, you know, lot more responsive and get that minimum standard. So at least local authorities can influence the policing, even though boroughs, local boroughs, are now tripartite or 2 or 3 boroughs coming together. So there is that sort of complexity around that. But I would like to think borough commanders, and I've seen a couple of borough commanders in the Met that seem to be understanding the importance of, as Whitney says, being more trauma responsive. But it's not ingrained in the culture. So that you know, there's individual borough commanders who are saying, yes, we're willing to do this, but it's not consistent. And it's that patchiness and that lack of consistency is a real concern.
Could I just add to Leroy's comment there? I think it's going to be incredibly difficult for the police to become trauma informed and trauma responsive, because again, there's this thing called moral injury. and I have a lot of kind of discussions with police officers around this, around kind of what happens when your job means you have to go against things that, or go against your morals and go against your kind of fundamental core beliefs. And in an institution like the police, for example, and kind of people that follow me on Twitter and everything like that know that I have kind of different views about the police at different times. But I think this kind of concept of moral injury is a profound one, and the fact that there's so many kind of officers that actually have to shut down as part of their coping mechanism. So a lot of the kind of reflective practice that I'll do with police officers, they can really understand trauma, and they will understand trauma at a neurological level and a biological level. So they can go through kind of exactly what's happening in the brain and exactly what's happening in the body from a very rational and logical perspective. To be trauma informed means you have to have a level of space to feel through this and kind of do the experiential work and do the reflective work. If you are in an institution that doesn't allow the space for you to do this, or doesn't allow the kind of aftercare or the kind of psychological care and well-being in this institution, it becomes fundamentally difficult to then become a kind of a trauma-informed police force or a trauma-informed prison service, because almost the nature of the beast is, you know, a lot of police officers won't be getting the time to really think through and reflect on what they're doing, and actually some of the trauma that they're experiencing and the things that they're dealing with. Because if you've ever kind of been behind the scenes on a gold review, for example, like that, when after there's been a homicide, there is a huge amounts of trauma that are being dealt with on a day-to-day basis. So in the first instance, kind of clinical supervision isn't there, reflective practice isn't there, the fundamentals to look after your own psyche and your own well-being isn't there. So then to take that to another level and to think about kind of being a trauma-informed and to be able to think about other people's well-being and other people's internal worlds, it's a very difficult ask. And this is why I think that we need to have some of the really difficult conversations around kind of what are the fundamentals that need to change within our systems, because our systems aren't working as they are, and we're not going to be able to transform some of these systems into being trauma-informed in their current kind of ways of being. It's just an impossible task.
Can I add to that, Whitney? There's a question about the police helicopter in Croydon, which is Croydon, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the biggest black populated borough in London. When you got the police sending the helicopters around every week, once a week at least, to police, that shows me the over-policing of a particular area. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's more crime committed there, but the response to involve the helicopter, can you imagine the trauma for the young children in the area that's seen that every week? It's in a weekly occurrence. So when you talk about trauma-informed police or the community or the areas that we reckon in, we've got to look at the young children that's exposed to these helicopters or the police activity that's around, because a child grows up, is a good cop, bad cop. What is the answer? How do you deal with that? So we've got to remember to take that into account, that young children are always exposed to the police helicopter activity or police activity. What does that do to that child's mind? What do they see? What are they seeing? What are they hearing? So we've got to take these things into account as well.
Would you like to share anything, Roger?
Yeah, well, maybe I don't want to kind of take us back a little bit, but there was a question or an issue in the chat about coming back to intergenerational trauma, in the sense that there's a kind of a spectre hanging there. So with parents and families, can that be detected? How can that be handled in a compassionate and responsive way?
Well, I think a lot of it depends if the public services, including police, will acknowledge that there is such a thing. I mean, they won't even acknowledge that there is trauma in the here and now, much less generational. So again, I think it's around how you get the data. More than likely, it's qualitative, and put it in a way that makes them start to recognize it. And this is where you have to work with them to bring them on this journey. And the Wave Trust and other organizations are trying to do this. But I really think we've got to test these things out in the court. I'm fed up of trying to, you see that. And again, the point that was raised by Whitney, there's too much change, even in politics. Borough commanders don't stay long enough. CEOs of local authorities don't stay long enough. This quick turnover. So, you might, a lot of these things are personality driven and not policy driven. So that's where I think if you can get the political will, and if you can't, get the court actions in place to get at least that policy driven approach, not just personality driven. And then underpin it with the generational issues, because there's a lot of research that's been done both about post-traumatic slave disorder and highlighting the generational issues. So I think it has to be done in a very in-depth work. I think it's something that's a real tough ask, but you never know. It might be something that the LH might want to pick up.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We've just got a few minutes left, and I just wanted to ask each speaker if they had a final message of hope.
I hope. Listen, change is what we've been asking for not just now. This is not nothing new. But change has to happen by people putting together, and that's the only way. Educating the police, educating the communities, early intervention with the young people. So much is needed in all areas. So there's no one paint that can paint everyone the same color. We have to teach everyone at different stages how to change and how to move, and that's what I would like to see change.
Can I step in and leave the best for last, with Whitney having the final word? I really believe, even though, as I said, the look and feel of policing and the wider justice system and the penal system is the worst I've seen it for many a decade, I really believe the post-George Floyd activity on a wider collective basis, and the allyship and the collaborations we're starting to see is really encouraging. And I think it's getting those officers who Whitney refers to about the moral injury to really think very carefully how they assimilate into the culture and adopt the norms and values of it against their own beliefs and values. I myself had that dilemma 30 years ago, or 37 years ago when I joined the Met in '83. And I said very clearly, I'm a black man who happens to be a cop. So I didn't have to feel the need to assimilate. I integrated, but I maintained my beliefs and values. And, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the autobiography, to say, listen, we know the organization's institution racist, but officers, you really need to wake up and be individuals and don't incur that moral injury. And I'm trying to do some work with them, the Black Police Association, around this, because we set up the BPA 25 plus years ago for that reason, to have a safe space where we don't have to assimilate. So I'd like to think more Black and minority ethnic officers will step up, will help their white counterparts to understand that they cannot just assimilate at the expense of truth and justice by closing ranks or inflicting injuries on people through their powers unnecessarily. So I'm hopeful. And I think all of the things that we talked about already is a way that we are owning it. And I'll say in closing, my mother used to say, who feels it knows it. We feel it, we know it, we've got to do something about it.
I want to go back to a comment that I've seen in the chat in relation to, is trauma-informed policing an oxymoron? And I think it might be. And this is a conversation I've been having with myself about the whole criminal justice system, because it goes back to kind of my opening comments. Can systems that are trauma-inducing and that are tools for systemic violence also be trauma-informed? If we train up every single person in that system to become trauma-informed, does it fundamentally change the system, or does it just show the system for what it is? And I think these are conversations we need to be having, and these are conversations that are going to make us uncomfortable, and these are conversations that are going to have many different views, and those views are going to conflict, and that's fine. I think we've got to a point where we run away from kind of conflict in relation to intellectual debate, and I think we need to kind of get back to that and really start being politically brave in our actions. In relation to hope, I think we are the hope. If we look at the fact that it's a Thursday evening and we've had at kind of one point over 40 attendees from all over the world, you know, there is an appetite for change. There are amazing people all over the place doing the work. And one of the messages that I continue to say day in, day out, it is fundamental that when we do this work, and any work around trauma, any work around pushing for systemic change, the revolution starts, and the true rebellion is how we take care of ourselves and how we take care of our communities. Because I see too many people overworking and giving too much and not focused on their own healing because they're wanting to save everyone else. Actually, the first step begins within. Do your work, look after yourself, prioritize your own well-being, the well-being of your family. And then as you do that, move out into the community. You know, one of the things I'm studying at the moment is nutrition and herbalism, because there's real fundamentals that we're not getting access to in the community, like organic food, good foods. You know, how do we look after ourselves? How do we kind of prevent diabetes? How do we prevent kind of particular conditions? How do we manage chronic stress? So I think the hope, or for me, the hope is empowering ourselves and looking after ourselves and working as a community and doing more for ourselves. Yes, we need to kind of fight the fight and go against the system for systemic change. And in some cases, it's working with the system. In some cases, it's working against the system. But always remember that when we are interacting with the system, we are in relationship with it. And that takes a lot of energy. So the real revolution, the real rebellion for me is how we look after ourselves as individuals, as family, and as a community. And that for me is where the hope lies.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You know, it's really hard to stop such a wonderful conversation, and but I just want to kind of thank you for the excellent way in which you've responded to questions, and you've given your presentations so powerfully, and I wanted to really thank you for being here. And I thank everyone for joining in the conversation. And we hope you've been encouraged to consider positive paths towards real change, personally and in society. I think these issues have just been absolutely vast. And thanks to the speakers for all their contributions. So I'm going to ask Koya to sort of lead us out.
Yes, thank you, Roger, and thank you, everybody. Yeah, I want to say thanks. We want to say, should I say, thanks to everyone who has joined this conversation. And in recognition of your attendance, you'll each get a CBPD certificate emailed to you from the London ACEs Hub. Please take a look at our feedback questionnaire you will receive shortly and give us your replies as soon as you can. And if you have found this evening helpful, which I'm sure you have, and wish to learn more about the ACEs and the Hub's work, please visit www.londonaceshub.org where you can sign up for our regular newsletter and mailing list. We also have lots of resources available on the website, included on our racial justice page. Please feel welcome to check them out and also follow our YouTube channel, make sure, where the recording of today's webinar will be made available within the next 2 weeks. Thank you all so much.